Today's lesson is 9.5, solving quadratic using square roots. So I'm going to explain what it is that we're doing first, and then we'll practice it for a little bit, and this one should be a little bit easier than what we did last week, as long as you focus on the video and actually try to understand what it is that I'm talking about. So last week we graphed a parabola and found the places where it crossed. So if we were doing this in a different lesson, we would graph it and say, okay, the x is equal to -2 because it crosses here, and then the x is also equal to 2. Today, we're going to use it without graphing. So the shortcut, if you look at the number here, -4, the solutions are the square root of that number. So the shortcut, rather than graphing and finding the two places where it crosses for specific cases, is if we solve for x and take the square root, then we can find the two answers. So notice that they're always the same exact number. One is minus and one is positive. So we're going to have two answers here, one that's positive and then the same number but negative. So the steps to do this, you should have written these down already. If not, go back up and write them down. So the first step is to get x squared by itself. So you might have to add or subtract to move something to the other side. And then if anything is attached to the x squared, you need to divide. And that should be the last step. Once you get x squared by itself, you have to take the square root of both sides. So on your calculator, the blue ones, you'll have to hit second and then x squared, and a square root option comes up, and then you just type the number and hit equals. After you do that, you're going to get a number, answer, but your answer, remember I said, the graph is always going to cross in two places, the same number, one's positive, one's negative. So your answer has two answers, one that's positive, one that's negative. So if you just want to write it down one time, like if I was writing the answer from the graph above, I could just say x equals positive and -2. So that's just a way to write it one time instead of twice, 2 and -2. So we're going to practice pretty basic ones first. So number one, x squared is already by itself. So all we need to do is take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x squared is x. And then the square root of 49, so what times itself is 49? So that'd be 7. And then don't forget, this is a common mistake, to put that plus and minus in front of your number, because it crosses at +7 and at -7 if we were to graph it. Number 2, same thing. Take the square root of both sides. So you get y equals positive and negative always. Square root of 144 is 12. And that's all on number 2. So you'll have a couple of those to practice after the video. We're going to move on to example 2. So now we've got two steps. So we're not just going to take the square root. We have to get x squared by itself first. So on number 1, the 5 is attached to the x squared. So we have to divide by 5. So you get x squared equals 500 divided by 5 is 100. So now that x squared is by itself, that's when we're going to take the square root. So square root of both sides, x equals positive and negative. Square root of 100 is 10. Number 2, to get y squared by itself, we're going to have to move this -12. So you have to do the opposite, which is add. So y squared equals 64. Now that y squared is by itself, we can take the square root. So y equals positive and negative. Square root of 64 is 8. Number 3, to get rid of that -7, since it's attached, we're going to have to divide on both sides by -7. So x squared equals 25. Take the square root of each side. So x is positive and -5. And you'll have a couple of those to practice after the video. So we're going to move on to example 3. So now we're going to have a couple steps to get x squared by itself. Same process, just a little bit more work to get to the end. So the very first thing you need to do is subtract or add. And in this case, we're going to subtract to get that 12 to the other side. So 3x squared comes down. 12 minus 12 is 0. Then you have to divide by 3 on both sides. And 0 divided by anything is just 0. So x squared equals 0. And then the square root of 0, what times itself is 0, has to be 0. So this is really the only case that you don't need positive and negative, because 0 isn't positive or negative, so it's just 0. If you put positive, negative, I wouldn't count it off. Number 2, so the very first thing we need to do is move that 1, so we're going to subtract to the other side. 7y squared equals 28, and then divide by 7 on both sides. Y squared equals 4. Now that y squared is by itself, take the square root, so y equals positive and negative 2. One more of these, number 3. First thing, move that negative 10, so because it's minus, we're going to have to add to both sides. So 2x squared equals 200. Divide by 2. X squared equals 100. And now take the square root because x squared is by itself. And x is positive and negative 10. You have a couple of those to practice. We're going to move on to example 4. So these are special cases. You do the same exact process. The answer just comes out a little bit different depending on the problem. There's a couple special cases here. So the first one, x squared is already by itself, so we don't have to do anything other than take the square root. So this one is, because 21 is not a perfect square, it's going to be a decimal. So when you type that in, you're going to get a pretty long decimal. You can just round it to the nearest tenth is fine. So x equals positive and negative 4.6. So again, you'll need a button on your calculator for that. You hit second and then x squared, and the square root symbol should pop up, and then you'll type 21 and equals, and you should get 4 point a long decimal. So just round it to 4.6. Okay, number 2. So we've got a 2 attached here. We've got to divide by 2 on both sides. So y squared equals negative 72. And then, depending on the calculator you have, I don't know what it will say here. But mine, I'm using just my phone. It says error. So it's either going to say error, domain error, divide by, or square root error, something like that. Just depends on what the calculator you have. So if you get an error, it's because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. It's not possible to get a negative when you multiply something by itself, even if that original number was negative, because they would cancel out. So if you ever get to this point and you're taking the square root with a negative number here, it's going to be no solution because it's not possible. So when you see error on your calculator, no solution. Let's try number 3. So first we're going to subtract 2. So 10x squared equals 290. Divide by 10. X squared equals 29. And that's not a perfect square, so we're going to get a decimal again. So x equals positive and negative 5.4. So make sure you know where that button is. If you're in a class with a teacher in it that can help you, then ask. If not, maybe a friend knows where the button is, because you are going to get some that are decimals and you'll need to know how to do that. You'll try some of those later. And the last thing we have, a couple things actually, you're going to need these formulas for. You should have written those down already as well, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. 2 formulas. The square formula, this is to find the area. You take whatever the side is, squared. In a square, they're all the same exact side, so it doesn't matter which one because they're all the same. So side times itself or squared will give you the area. A circle, this is called pi. I don't know how much you have talked about that in the past, but there's a button for that on your calculator. It is 3.14 with a lot of numbers after it. You can use 3.14, but it's much more exact if you use the pi button on your calculator, and most calculators should have one. And then the R stands for radius, and if you remember from middle school probably, the radius is halfway across the circle. It's not the whole thing. It's from the center to the edge. So we're going to be using these formulas to find some missing parts. So first says find the side of a square with an area of 81 centimeters squared. So here's the formula again. The area equals side squared. So we're going to plug in what we know. It says find the side, so we don't know S, when the area is 81. So we know the A is 81. And now it just wants us to solve that. That's exactly the type of equation we've been solving this whole time. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. S equals, typically we would put positive and negative 9 here, but because it's a word problem and it's a shape, negative 9 for the length of a square does not make sense. So we're just going to put the positive version when it's a word problem. So then make sure you label 9 centimeters. Number 2 is a circle, so the area formula for that is pi r squared. So we're going to plug in what we know. We know the area is 28. So 28 equals pi r squared. So I can't take the square root yet because the r squared is not by itself. So I've got to divide by pi first. So this is when you need to use your pi button, otherwise it's not as exact. So on your phone, I'll show you where that is, if that's what you're using. So it was 28 divided by, and it's down here on an iPhone, pi, and then you have to hit equals. If you're using just one of those blue calculators, I don't think you have to hit equals after that. I'm not sure. So we're going to round that to the nearest tenth for now. So that'd be 8.9 equals r squared. That's not the final answer because r is still squared. So at this point, I've got to take the square root to get that by itself. So then r equals, square root is 2.98, so I'm going to round that to 3.0. And then the label would be inches. Okay, we've got one more example, word problems. These are pretty similar to what we were just doing. It's just not using the same shapes. And it will give you a formula within the word problem if it's needed. So a museum is planning an exhibit that will contain a large globe. The surface area for the globe is 315 feet squared. We're trying to find the radius that gives that surface area. So it gives us the equation and tells us that S is surface area and R is the radius. So we need to plug into this equation what we know. We know the surface area is 315, so that goes in for S. 4 is a part of the formula, so is pi, and we don't know the R. So now we need to solve that equation. We need to get R by itself, so in order to do that, I need to divide by 4, and I also need to divide by pi. So you can do that all at once if you want to. You could do that in 2 separate steps if that's easier for you. So in your calculator, do 315 divided by 4. Go ahead and hit equals, and it should say 78.75. And then we're going to divide that by pi. And now you should get 25.007 if you round equals r squared. Again, that's not the answer yet because r is not by itself. So take the square root of both sides, and then you get r is 5.0. And the label is feet. And you'll have one of those to try on your own after the video. So at this point, you'll go to the next slide. You'll have 10 questions about this lesson. So if you don't feel prepared for those 10 questions, maybe go back and rewatch any examples that you're confused about and try to understand them before you move on. The 10 questions are worth a grade. It goes through the same exact type of problems that I just did, so they should be fairly easy. When you're finished with that, hit submit and ask the sub for your homework spend the rest of the class time working on that assignment. If you get finished with that, I'm sure you have plenty of other algebra worksheets that you could work on. If you've been gone any, you might want to grab some extra copies and maybe watch the videos on Classroom. If you have any questions, you can email Miss Geyer or I. We'll both be back tomorrow. Have a great day.